Hi, we enter into the beginning of Acts 6 today as we look at the first verses of this unit in Acts 6 to 7. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit, we went over these questions you can see on the right side of the screen, which explore some of the issues that biblical scholarship has engaged in the last 100-and-something years since the advent of historical criticism. And as we look at that, as I noted in the introductory video, much of that is tainted by German anti-Semitism and Protestant superiority over Catholicism and Judaism. So the good news is that in recent decades, there's been a whole output of wonderful scholarship that's put aside that prejudiced view of the previous generations and really entered into the cultural context of Luke's world to see more closely what's really going on here. So we won't go over all these today, but these first 5 are ones that we're focused on in this immediate scene. And as we look at the shape of our section, we see this chiasm in the first 7 verses, framed by the disciples are multiplying, and the disciples multiplied, and the 12 and the apostles. And one of the issues that we need to look at, a number of them, is how historical interpretations of Acts 6 are no longer viable. So we need to clear the air of some of these that may be in your head if you've had only a superficial or a certain kind of entry into these verses. So first, the apostles take the superior role of proclaiming the word, while the 7 the inferior role of waiting on tables. In fact, as we'll see, there's no status difference between the two, and there's certainly no status difference between the two activities. That's largely based on a prejudice of sexism and the analogy between Martha and Mary here, where the assumption is that waiting on tables, as we see in verse 2, is either women's work or low-level work, like we would imagine in a restaurant. But whatever we imagine is happening here, the apostles are not providing a restaurant for the widows, so we'll have to look more closely at that. There's nothing about inferior or superior roles here. Second, arguments over whether Jewish or Greek models of providing food charity are at issue. One of the key questions is the scene about food at all? And as you can see on the left side, where the New RSV has food, my note below notes there's no word for food in the Greek at all. It's simply the daily distribution, and as we'll see, there's a question of how to translate that as well. So there is no issue of Jewish versus Greek models, because as we'll see, food is not really the issue at all. Another one, and this goes to the prejudices of German Protestants in the 19th century especially, taking the Hellenists here as more liberal for their openness to Greco-Roman culture, and the Hebrews as more conservative in supposedly rejecting other cultures. And we can see that although that's clearly a result of the prejudice of German Protestant scholars whose anti-Judaism was not challenged, there was an element for a while in which certain members of Israel saw Hellenistic culture as polluting them and as leading them astray. And we see that especially in 1 Maccabees. Although scholars even of Maccabees note that the authors of this book are making it much more dichotomous between two cultures than actually existed on the ground. But that is one of the issues we'll have to see when we look at Hellenists. But the idea that the Hellenists are more liberal is simply the Protestant theologians and biblical scholars presenting themselves in that context and presenting the Jews, therefore, as more conservative, and the language of Stephen's condemnation of them as stiff-necked and hard-hearted in the language of prophets as well. So we won't be reading it through that lens. Fourth, the neglect of widows implies the women's poverty and dependence on male support. And there may well be dependence on male support in a patriarchal culture, but Luke shows widows with assets substantial enough to be sought by plunder by the scribes, as we saw back in Luke 20, when Jesus warned them, "Beware of the scribes who offer long prayers and devour the houses of widows." We also saw in Luke 18 the widow who had enough resources to go pester the judge until she got justice. And we saw in the beginning of Luke, Anna, who at 84 years old certainly seemed to be doing just fine without external help. So the widows are not necessarily poor, but they are a part of the community that needs support here. Fifth, the scene shows the ordination of the first deacons in the church. As we'll note, the notion of deacons as a church office is anachronistic in the 1st century CE. But if you just go out to the internet and search for Acts 6 and deacons, this is what you get. And so you see that prejudice and false assumption has been long-standing in biblical scholarship. So we'll put that aside as well. And finally, not for today's video, but for the one that follows, the question of the members of the synagogue of the freedmen who challenged Stephen on theological grounds, supposedly objecting to his supposed denigration of Moses and God. But as we'll see, it's much more likely that their opposition is based on jealousy of their independent system of banking, which is to say resource distribution flowing from putting the proceeds of things that people sold at the feet of the apostles at the end of chapter 4. not connected to the Jerusalem temple. And we'll see how, well, once we get rid of these false interpretations that led scholars to endless argument, we'll see how nicely everything seems to fit together. So let's put our keywords up and jump right into our scene. So as you can see in my note below, Penner is the source of the chiasm that we see on the right side of the screen. And as we continue down here, we note that one of the themes that people ask is whether there are parallels in the Hebrew Bible in Exodus or other places, not to the question of providing a soup kitchen, but to the providing of aid to the leader. And if we go back to Exodus 18, we can see how that's at work here when Moses' father-in-law says, "What is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone when the people stand around you from morning to evening?" And he goes down, as you can see farther down the screen, his father-in-law gives him counsel to teach them the way, in other words, to give them the word first, and then let them sit as judges. So notice how that becomes parallel to what we see here, the question of teaching them the statutes and instructions, in other words, giving them the word of God, so that then they can assist in carrying out the ministry. And so we'll see how that's in the background as part of what we see here. Others have suggested, as Capper does, the community of goods in its Palestinian cultural context did not mean that all had direct access to funds and resources, but rather that resources were controlled by a limited number of offices. Hence, mention of an underprivileged group does not contradict organized communities of goods. And that's a key point. And the note further below about Qumran is among those who are trying to find, as Capper did, a question of parallel food distributions, but we don't have to go that way. But also important is Coed, who has a very nice piece that I referred to just briefly before, but not by name, connecting this passage we're on in Acts 6 with Luke 10:38-42 as a diptych, both around the question of word and ministry. And he says, the Old Testament model suggests that in Acts 6:1-7, the service at stake is more like serving as a minister to the crown than as an attendant in a soup kitchen. Just as Joseph became minister of Pharaoh, just as the 70 are made rulers assisting Moses, and just as the 70 are made prophets, so the 7 men in Acts are installed to a public function under someone's direction as ministers of the apostles and as prophets of the word of the Lord. And finally, on this note, it's Walton here who highlights that ever since Irenaeus, the passage has been seen as a precedent for the ordination of deacons, but it's anachronistic and read through lenses of later texts, so we don't have to go there now. So with that in mind, let's just jump right into our immediate text. So during those days, and it's a phrase we saw once before in Acts, we don't see it again, but it highlights here the simultaneity of what's going on, and that sets us back into the narrative context, which often scholars don't pay attention to, reading this like it's a complete break. But it's not a complete break. During the days of what we'd just seen, where Ananias and Sapphira had refused to give everything and had died, and then Peter was challenged, and we saw Gamaliel in the Sanhedrin worrying about, if this is from God, you can't stop it, and if it's not from God, it'll fall on its own, and therefore we'll stop persecuting it, at least for now. So it's during that time that the community, celebrating its expression of the Holy Spirit by the sharing of goods, recognizes the Sanhedrin is against them. And that's the key context here for what goes on. So during those days, when the disciples were increasing or literally multiplying in number, again, framing the chiasm we see here, and that's part of the main point. They're growing so fast that they don't have enough people to provide for the needs that are promised according to what Jesus has told them, that everybody should get what they need. So then we get to these key words of who's at issue. The Hellenist, the word for Hellenist here, as you can see below, Helleniste, is not in the Septuagint, in Philo, or in Josephus, and its meaning is disputed because it's the only use of it in Greek literature that we know of. The bottom line, without getting into all the detailed arguments linguistically and historically that scholars have engaged, is it almost certainly about Greek speakers, as Walton notes below and as most scholars agree. One of the challenges, though, is that even in Jerusalem, and especially at the feast, people would speak many languages, as we saw at Pentecost. When all the people gathered there, certainly all Israelites coming for a Jerusalem feast, but coming from different countries, understood what Peter and the others were saying in their own languages. So plainly, Jerusalem, especially at feasts, has a host of people from all over, and it would have been true apart from Jewish feasts. It would have been true just for international trade reasons as well as perhaps the presence of other soldiers, Roman and otherwise, in the area. So these would certainly be Greek speakers, but it's not to suggest that there aren't otherwise Greek speakers in Jerusalem. So then they complained or grumbled, using the classic word from Numbers and Exodus for grumbling against Moses and grumbling against God. And we can see that. Let's just look at one of the examples from Numbers here in 17:10. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Put back the staff of Aaron before the covenant to be kept as a warning to rebels, so that you may make an end to their complaints or their grumbling against me, or else they will die." So it highlights a situation where people are traditionally grumbling against their leaders, taking them into a new direction. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. But why they're grumbling is yet to be revealed, and we'll see why. They're grumbling against the Hebrews, and Hebrew, Hebreos here, is only here in Acts or Luke. It's only 2 other times in the New Testament. And one of the issues, as my note below has, Luke has people, as we've seen Peter already several times, use Israelites as the positive designation, and Judaioi, translated usually as Jews, for opponents, although we have not seen that yet. We've simply seen their categories like Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees, and the Sanhedrin, but not as a category Judaioi. And what that means in Luke, we'll have to see. But Hebrews is clearly not an ethnic group or a geographic group. There's no territory called Hebrew. One of the interesting questions is, why can't they hear in their own language given the Pentecost situation? But that must have been a one-off thing. As my note down below has, the linguistic situation is similar to quote-unquote Mexicans who speak Spanish in an indigenous village with its own local language, surrounded by imperial English, or to say Latin speakers, assuming the Romans in this area speak Latin. Some would and some would not, Latin being the imperial language of the West and Greek the imperial language of the East. So it's a linguistic issue here. And as Keener notes below, this is exactly the situation one finds in most post-colonial bilingual settings today, though the national trade language is typically used less and at a less sophisticated level in more remote rural areas where it is less needed. Many Palestinian Jews learn Greek as an educated cultural language or for urban trade. Gymnasia, Greek names, and elements such as architecture and pottery show Greek influences. And as he notes further, even rabbinical literature includes some 1,500 Greek loanwords, underscoring the point that there really was a multilinguistic environment here, but not everybody spoke them both equally, and that's plainly what's at issue. And who's being neglected are the widows. And as I already noted, this doesn't necessarily mean poor people, but it does mean dependent people. We'll see widows a couple more times in Acts, although I already noted the times we saw them in Luke, and we see them noted right there. As Cradle notes, the Hellenistic widows, quote, were more vulnerable because they had moved from the diaspora to Jerusalem and were without extended families who could support them. Although he doesn't necessarily know that. That's assuming if they're Greek-speaking, they're not native to Jerusalem. But they may well be for the reasons we just saw. They may well be there for their second generation. We simply don't know. As Coet notes, beginning to see that this is not about food, he says, these widows were in need of preachers who could teach them in Greek, when as Greek speakers they came together at their tables. And notice he's suggesting the tables neutrally, not necessarily about food or anything, just coming together there. So, then they're being neglected, and neglected is the right term here, partheorontu, only here in the New Testament. Walton notes the tense as the imperfect form to suggest kept being neglected, like it's an ongoing problem, not just a one-off thing. The Louanita lexicon, as you can see below, suggests it may be important to restructure this statement in Acts 1 to read, quote, because when help was being given out each day, their widows got nothing. And then we get to the key phrase, translated in the New RSV as daily distribution of food, but as I noted, there is no food. The key phrase here, te diaconia de kathamerine, is only here in the New Testament. Linda Maloney suggested be translated simply everyday ministry. Hence the ministry of the day, or the daily ministry. Luke Johnson is one of those people holding still the older view that it's the parallels with organized Jewish charity. But then we see contrary, Harrison Mills, who we'll see more about in just a little bit, who says, quote, various exegetical efforts to explain the root cause of this problem have only added to the confusion by attempting to interpret the English phrase daily distribution in terms of the traditional Jewish charitable activities of the time. And Coet, writing before Harrison Mills, also disagrees with Johnson, seeing the word as a formal commission from an authority, and here related to the word rather than food. Citing Collins, he notes, quote, in Acts 6, the Greek-speaking members of the community complained against those who spoke Aramaic that their own housebound or shut-in widows were being overlooked in the great preaching that was going on day by day in the environment of the temple. And that suggestion that they're housebound or shut-in would take away the issue of the assumption they're poor. They can't get around because they're physically limited. Although, again, we don't know that. And Coet qualifies that based on the parallel with the Mary and Martha story in Luke 10:38-42, noting diaconia contains concern for material care, including financial support. So suggesting even if it's not about food, it is about some material care, not just about the word. There are actually two kinds of ministry at issue here. So let's jump further into verse 2 here. And so here's the beginning of the response. And the 12 called together the whole community, and we have to look at some of the language there in particular. This is the last use of the 12 in Acts. And note they have authority to call the community together and to determine the action to be followed, but the action will be determined by the larger community. Called together is the right word here, but literally it's not the whole community, but the fullness of the people here. So they called together all of them. And as far as we know, that's many thousand at this point, and said, not that it is not right, but that it's not pleasing, as we see on the right side, matching pleased here, the same verb here, rest on, at the same time. So first it's not pleasing, and then it is pleasing. It's not pleasing, and we need to be very careful here to see what's going on, that we should neglect, notice using a different word than neglect up here. Leave behind is the word here for katalipsansas, other times as left. So not to neglect, like to not treat it as well, but to abandon it or give it up altogether, the Word of God. And this is the phrase that leads so many people, and a little of it is sexist and a little bit is classist, to suggest that waiting on tables both is like a restaurant and serving food, but also inferior to serving the Word. And really, the phrase here, diakonine trapezes, can mean, as Harrison Mills suggests, to serve at the banking tables. And would we consider in our cultural context, did they and theirs, that people serving at banking tables are somehow culturally inferior to people preaching the Word? Not in our cultural context. We'll have to explore more of whether it is in theirs. He says below, after noting how scholarship has created numerous problems by its misreading of the scene, he notes, quote, when the alternative interpretation to serve at the banking tables is applied to Acts 2, the episode involving the Hellenist widows can be seen to highlight nothing more complicated or sinister than a competency or workload problem. He then adds, to serve at the banking tables and to serve in the bank are plausible renderings of this phrase, and he notes several parallels. Then adding some context about banking at the time, he says, by the 1st century CE, banking operations had been an integral component of the economic activities of religious sects for well over 3 millennia. He notes that this would resonate with Luke's elite audience, long familiar with trapeza as bank. The free market operations of a trapeza within the primitive church in Jerusalem had the potential to divert significant funds of business activity away from the temporal-centric economy. And if we want to see how that goes, all we have to do is jump further into Acts when Paul is at Ephesus, and we see how the silversmiths, who were concerned that this proclamation that gods made with hands are not real gods, exactly the same language that Stephen will proclaim in the next chapter, will destroy their business of making little silver statues of Artemis. But they don't go publicly about their economic issue. They go publicly about what I would call the religio issue, in the literal sense of to bind again. The people are bound around Artemis and their worship of Artemis, and hence the economy of Artemis, just like here in Jerusalem, they're bound around Yahweh and the economics of Yahweh in the temple. So even though the banking element is a little bit behind the scenes here, the parallel with Ephesus later really shows that the economic activity is often hidden behind the supposedly noble religious activity. But that's not being hidden here by the characters. That's only being hidden by scholars who didn't read it that way, and now we can read it that way. So continuing on to verse 3. So this is what he offers. As Walton notes, the solution to a communal problem is made through a communal process. And therefore, friends is what the NORSV does to be more inclusive, but I like to translate these things more literally here as brothers, even though it is gender exclusive, to highlight the familial element of how he's addressing these people, that they're a family, just like the Israelites were once a family. Even though friend is an important word in the Roman political sense of being like a friend of Caesar in John's Gospel, here the issue is siblings. So we could want to be inclusive, the better word would be siblings. Select from among yourselves, various meanings for the word there, including oversight, as we saw, our visitation at the beginning of Acts, as we see in chapter 1. From among yourselves, or as Capper notes, rather than integrating the Hellenist widows into the wider community, provision is made from within the Hellenist community for their care, but at the quote-unquote cost of the community of common goods, which would suggest there's perhaps 2 different communities based on their language, although that's not necessarily the case, and we'll see perhaps it's not as we continue. 7 men of good standing. And Fitzmyer, the great scholar that he is, but throws up his hands and says why 7 is chosen is anyone's guess. But we can see the parallels. Just like we saw earlier in Luke's Gospel, that there's a 70 appointed, and the 70 of the Septuagint, of course, and there's the 70 and that Moses appoints as well. Just like the 120 in Acts 1 evokes the 12, now the 70 certainly evokes 70 as well as a fullness of delegation. And notice the criteria that's described about these people before they do anything. No RSV is men of good standing, but literally are witnessed for, which is to say they have a good public reputation. People know them for doing good things. And certainly among this group would suggest they're already following in the way of Jesus. Full of the Spirit and of wisdom. Are those two things are hendiadys? Well, we can read it either way. The phrase full of the Spirit without holy or the Lord is in these various places. And we also see wisdom described again for Stephen a little farther down, whom we may appoint for this task. And the word for task here is need, kreos. And so it's not just a task and like something to get done, but a need within the community. Harrison Mills notes the word can be used as distribution of funds by Vine, although he acknowledges that Vine is an older lexicon and many scholars don't follow it now. But he analogizes to micro-lending today by faith-based organizations as what's going on here. It's not that it's just giving to the people, it's providing what they need so they can survive. And then while we, for our part is not in the Greek, devote ourselves, and the word for devote, it means devote, and it's not a translation issue, but I really want to highlight, give ourselves completely, that sense of devotion, to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And prayer is the key, the first listening to God before you can offer the word. And then we get to the resolution where everybody feels that it's a good thing here. And so, as Willie Jennings notes, this is the heart of apostolic succession, in which a joining happens in the spirit that binds hope to struggle and the common to resurrection. So the whole community is pleased here, and again, it's all the fullness as we saw earlier. Usually the word plethos is more like a multitude or crowd than community, but plainly these people are all together in the spirit. And they chose these 7. And as in many lists, most scholars assume that the one that's first, Stephen, is the most important, and he's the only one who's described with any attributes about him other than Nicholas, a proselyte, but there's elements about him. So let's look a little more closely at him. The name Stephanos means crown. All the 7 have Greek names, although, as Keener notes, Stephen was a very common Greek name, but rare in Palestine. He's a man full of faith, and notice his various attributes. So full of faith and the Holy Spirit, full of wisdom, and witness to. So all those elements about him. Philip we'll see in chapter 8, after we see Stephen in chapter 7, and the rest of these we never see again. But the fact that Nicholas, a variation on Nicodemus, victory of the people there, a proselyte, indicates that he started off as a Gentile. And that's a clue to what's coming. We don't know if he's a proselyte because of the message of Jesus or otherwise, but the fact that he's in Antioch will lead us to pay attention to Antioch, as we'll see in chapter 11, 13, and many others. So Antioch will be a key city as we go. So to reach the end of what I know is a long video here, now they have this little ritual that they had them stand before the apostles. And the ironic thing is, if you look for illustrations of the scene, as I did, almost all the art, whether that's AI or traditional art, has them kneeling before the apostles, despite the fact that the text explicitly says they had them stand there. And they're standing. They're not subservient. The apostles are not like bishops ordaining deacons. I've been to those ordinations in the Catholic Church, and the deacon candidates lie on their ground and make a personal vow, not to the church and not to God, but to the person of the bishop. But here, that's not what's happening. These are not deacons. These are people had hands laid on them in order to continue a mission to people who had not had ministry given them before. There's an interesting question of who the they is here, because there's 3 groups. The 7, the apostles, the 12, and then the other they. So presumably this is the whole community, and so everyone is taking part. The community is ordering the ritual, not the apostles. I think that's really a nice thing, like the congregation telling the ministers up front what to do. And they laid their hands on them. A biblical expression of solidarity. We see it back in Numbers and Deuteronomy and other places. But as my note below has, note they were not said to have laid hands on Matthias when they selected him to replace Judas, and we didn't hear about him again. And so our scene concludes with another summary here, and it's an interesting summary that will set up what follows. The Word of God continued not just to spread here, but to grow or increase. So just as the number of disciples is multiplying, so the Word is growing. And as my note below suggests, not necessarily geographic spread yet, but gaining in power. It's getting more powerful. It's echoing something like we see in Exodus, where the Hebrews are multiplying, and the Egyptians become afraid of them. And we already know the Sanhedrin are afraid of these people, and we'll see in a moment how the members of the synagogue of the freedmen are afraid, and they hide their fear with anger and accusation. So the number of the disciples increased, literally arismoth here, number, multiplied as we saw earlier. And then we get an interesting coda. a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith in this translation. We see that the high priest, who's certainly connected with the Sanhedrin, will be part of the opposition to this group, not surprisingly, because there are questions about the temple. But we already saw at the very beginning of Luke, priests like Zechariah, who are waiting for the visitation of God and understand that the Roman control of Jerusalem is not God's will. And so they've been waiting piously, along with Anna and Simeon and others, for this moment. So many of these priests are becoming obedient or listened to. And this is the first time we hear the phrase, the faith. It's an unusual thing. It's certainly not a Jewish phrase in that sense. It's being invented here for this moment. But notice what it's not. It's not Christianity. It's not a new religion. Later we'll see it be called the way, and it's interesting that Luke doesn't call it the way here. But it's simply the trust in what the apostles are preaching that they're beginning to believe in more than what their own bosses, the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, are preaching. That can't go well for the relationship between these two groups. And we'll see how that plays out immediately in the next scene. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.